Good evening. Call the special meeting for the Ames City Council for February 21st to order. Sarah?
Right. I'll go ahead and call to order the special meeting of the Parks Commission joint workshop with the Ames City Council to order.
Okay, we have one item on the agenda, and that's presentation on the ADA access audit and transition plans. I'll turn it over to Keith and his staff.
All right. Good evening, Mayor, council members, and commission members. Excited to kind of go through this with you tonight. There's a number of documents that you received in the information on Friday. Staff report, I'm not going to go through that, and I'll just highlight maybe a couple of things, and then I'll introduce John McGovern, and then he'll kind of go through the PowerPoint and answer questions as we go. So with this, as you're aware, we have done a good number of things that with accessibility. We've done the Miracle Park. We've done the kayak canoe launch up at Ada Hayden. Anytime that we've been doing a playground renovation, we've been trying to make that accessible in a number of different ways. So there's a lot of things that we've been doing, but as we go through and continue with the renovations, there's a lot that we don't know what we have to do. And that's why we contracted with the WT group. They're out of Chicago. And it was really with John's group, a lot of his staff are former Parks and Recreation employees. So they know our business. It was really a good fit, for us. But we really wanted to try to do is with this audit and then developing a transition plan is to see where our deficiencies are, within the park system, our facilities. I should note, and John might touch on this a little bit as well, is that's what we really looked at is the facilities, our parks. This included the cemeteries. We did look at those as well. But it did not look at program access when programs from a standpoint of individual programs like a fitness class or things. And John will give a little bit more of a breakdown. Now, one of the things tonight with this is we're not looking for commission or council to take any action. What we're just wanting to do is give you an update. And then after tonight, staff has a lot of work to do. If you looked at all those documents, we need to take a look, prioritize, what's a high priority, medium priority, low priority. Take a look at all these recommendations and find out what is already included in another plan. So if you look at, just in phase one, there's about probably $400,000 or so with playground renovations that is being recommended. Well, we already have a playground replacement plan, so that would bring down that overall number that you see in this transition plan. So what we want to do is when we bring this back to you at a future time, have all that information and let you know, all right, here's what's in the plan. Here's maybe what is going to be done through another project. So any of the trail deficiencies that we have out at Ada Hayden, the next 3 years we'll be doing the trails around the lake, which is already in the CIP. So we'll try to pull some of that cost out for you and give you a better feel for, hey, here's what's left and here's what this is going to cost. So I'll introduce John McGovern and again, he's with the WT group, and he may give himself a little bit more information or a little bit background on himself. But one of the things that I think is really good with John, there have been 3 committees at the national level to talk about ADA. When they first did the Americans with Disabilities Act, and then I think there was an amendment, and then there's also the 2010 standards. And John is actually the only person that has sat on all 3 of those committees. Kind of speaks to his expertise. He's got a lot of knowledge, and again, he's got a good group of people. So with that said, I will turn it over to John.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you, members of the council, for the time tonight, and nice to meet the Parks and Recreation Commission as well. As I wander through the PowerPoint, if you have questions, don't save them till the end. Just interrupt me and stop me as we're going through. And what I'll try to do is give you the look at the project from 30,000 feet. So I'll talk a little bit more about our background so that you have some context. I'll talk about the ADA requirements for existing sites. As Keith said, that was our focus. We did not look at policy or how people with disabilities are supported when they seek inclusive participation, although we did talk a lot about that today in a staff training event. I'll briefly describe the project scope, talk about how we did our work, some of the common issues that we saw during that process. I'm going to commend you for a lot of the things that you've already done as well. And then I'll talk about the transition plan requirements. Keith made a good point about blending the transition plan with other city plans. We certainly don't want to see a transition plan in a silo. We think it fits best with master plans and CIP and your regular budget process. And then during the process, I'll answer questions that you have, and maybe I'll talk a little bit about enforcement, since that's been an issue in some Iowa communities. So my background is Parks and Recreation. I started in Parks and Recreation as a center director, always responsible as I moved up for making sure that programs and services, as well as facilities and parks, were accessible for people with disabilities. I was always interested in civil rights, so I went to law school at night while working in Parks and Recreation. I don't want to try that again, but I don't regret it, and it was perfect timing. I graduated right at the time the ADA was being debated, so it was a natural fit for my own interests. I left local government in 2008, and we started this consulting practice, and we've since worked with more than 500 cities across the country. Last year, we worked in 18 states, helping cities and states, large and small, comply with the sometimes not so clear requirements of the ADA. We had a great team at Parks and Recreation to work with. Keith and Joshua and Courtney and all the staff. We did 2 training events today, one for parks and facility staff and one for recreation and program staff. All were interactive. The staff had great questions. And as I've described the team when talking with them, you have a Parks and Recreation staff that has a pretty high IQ from an access and inclusion perspective. It clearly is a part of the daily decision-making process. One of the requirements in the scope of work is community engagement. That just makes sense. Every plan that a city has is better if you have more community involvement. We're fortunate to have Mainstream Living work with us in that process when we did that, back in October. Let me take a little dive into the requirements for existing sites. Title II, which is the second bullet point here, Congress clearly wanted units of local government and states to lead the way here before businesses and nonprofits. It's a lot easier for a business to draw a line in the sand and say, we're not going to retrofit this particular facility. Their test is completely different than yours. They only have to remove barriers at existing sites when doing so is readily achievable, which is federalese for easily accomplishable without great expense. I think a loophole that even I could drive a truck through. Local governments have a very different requirement, though. You must make the programs and facilities accessible. So programs are to be thought of as very, very broadly here. This is a program. Making public comment or making a report to a city council meeting is a program. It's an opportunity. Grabbing a sandwich and sitting in a park, not today, and eating at a picnic table is a program. Golf is a program. Certainly registering for classes is a program too. Drop-in tennis, drop-in basketball. All of those are opportunities that the city and the department have felt strongly enough to make available to your residents. So it's the program that counts. And so related to that, the Department of Justice makes a point of saying that not necessarily every existing site must be made accessible. So that's good. That's good, clear direction, but there's no ratio or percentage. So if you have I'm going to use the example I used today. If you have 21 playgrounds, is making one playground accessible enough? I'd say no. Do you have to make all 21 accessible? Clearly, the answer, according to the Department of Justice, is no. So what's the right number? So we strive for, and it's in our reports, a minimum of 1 of 3 of recurring assets, with the notion being that, using my example of 21, that there will now be 7 playgrounds that are accessible. And then in 2024, when you replace another playground, it's new construction. And so it must be fully accessible. So now there's 8 of 21. And then 2 years later, there's 9 of 21. So the idea is that over time, as you implement your CIP and your playground replacement schedule, that more and more of the percentage of those sites will be made accessible. Unique is different. You only have one ice arena, for example. So unique facilities tend to have a higher priority because you can't make ice available somewhere else and not make the arena accessible. So unique has always been, in the eyes of the Department of Justice, the type of asset that should be treated differently. Unique also, I think, touches this issue of the difference between existing sites and design and construction at new sites. We firmly believe that accessibility with regard to parks and facilities is a function of 3 factors. One is design. So did the architect or the LA or the engineer get it right? And for the most part today, 31 years after the effective date of the ADA, most do. The second part is construction, though. And I think everybody in the audience here, council members, commission members, we've all seen perfectly designed sites not be constructed as they were intended. So that's where some of the access issues do occur. And the third issue is maintenance. Maintenance is arguably the issue that the city has complete control over. You could argue the same for construction in the sense of project management efforts by staff. And certainly the design team works for the city, not independently. But those 3 factors all bring a little bit of difference to this. In our work and in the standards, we're required to evaluate your sites against 2 things. First is the 2010 standards for accessible design. Those were adopted in 2010 and became effective in 2012. And then any Iowa requirements, which are more stringent than the federal requirement. So the easiest example of that is restrooms. So at the golf course where we did the training events today, and perhaps in this building, you've noticed that there's a vertical grab bar in the accessible stalls if you've ever used one. That's not a federal requirement. So that's an Iowa requirement that's more stringent because it adds another means of accessibility to that site. We also include smart practices, though. Rulemaking is not finished here, and in particular for some sites that are important to every Parks and Recreation Department, this causes some confusion at times. This department, as does every other that we work for, has trails. There is no final and enforceable design standard for trails today. But you're required to make the program of trails accessible. So we followed in our audit work the highest federal level writing that the federal government must use for federally owned and operated trails. Same for picnic areas, which is silly if you think about it. There are at least 3 commercially available picnic tables that are accessible in design. So this isn't a hard task to get done, but for whatever reason, it hasn't happened. We also looked at smart practices. So these are things that other jurisdictions, including you, have done that exceed the minimum requirements and make the site more usable or accessible by people who have a disability. So we include that in our site reports, and where we're referencing a smart practice, we call it out as a smart practice so that you'll know the difference between that and a requirement. We already talked
John,
about.
could I
Yes,
ask
please.
you something about program versus site and maybe context of the site. Because as I was reading those regulations, it struck me that we have some instances where the program seems accessible within its site, but the context for that site might not be accessible. So let me just give an example of that. We got an email recently about Banshell Park, and why don't we have sidewalks all around Banshell Park? We have them on two sides, but we don't have them on the two other sides, which actually happen to be right next to the playground. So Parks and Recreation presumably would be looking at the site of the playground for accessibility. Are they also then supposed to be looking at the sidewalks around the park, which are more of the street right of way, I suppose, than the site of the playground itself?
It's a good, nuanced question. We talked about it a little bit this morning with parks and facility staff. Public rights of way do have to be accessible, of course. There should also be a transition plan developed for public rights of way. But in every city and county and state, everybody approaches sidewalks and where they're going to be or if they're going to be in a very different way. So our scope, we limited ourselves to park assets within the park. If there was public right of way, we evaluated it. I can tell you that, in every one of the 50 states, this is one of the biggest persons with disabilities advocacy issues. Because if there's not a sidewalk there and you're going from point A to point C, you at some point wind up in the street. And the incidence of people with disabilities who are struck by an auto is much, much higher than it is for people who are ambulatory because they tend to have a lower profile. So it's a hot topic issue, but it really didn't fit in our scope. If it was there, we audited, but if it wasn't, we didn't make a recommendation about it.
And it may be then something that Parks and Rec would be looking at recommending to Public Works or whatever other departments might be applicable.
Now, one of the things with Banshell Park, even though we only have sidewalks on the east and the south, we do have crossings or curbs at all four corners. And there are trails there are paths that go through the park as well. So there are some other ways. But that is something that we have had, some conversation, about, with the sidewalks. One of the things there that's very difficult is the terrain. Because if you've been there, if you go on that north side, it's pretty much you're up here. We have a walkway from kind of one corner to the other corner. But if you're putting a sidewalk right along the right of way, it drops off pretty significantly. So I think the initial design was probably put that kind of the sidewalk, think of it as maybe a sidewalk. It just, you have to go into the park a little bit because it's a little flatter. So those are things that we need to always continue to look at.
Counselor, I'm a tiny bit off scope here, but in the Title II regulation, just to lend a little bit more to the importance of public right-of-way assets, it's the only part of Title II that lists priorities for barrier removal, unless it's for an alteration. And public right-of-way that serves city, county, and state and school district, local government offices is the number one priority for making public right-of-way accessible. More so than residential, more so than retail, more so than business. So we often see that in parks and facilities. There does tend to be a more complete public right-of-way asset, but we also see it at times where it's not.
Thank you.
The bottom bullet point is worth referencing to the Department of Justice. If you called them tomorrow, they would tell you to remove barriers at your existing sites as soon as is possible. That's not very helpful policy guidance. So we try to work with each of our municipal clients, and with Ames, we created a range for each of the 3 phases that we developed and recommended a range of from 9 to 16 years for barrier removal for you. That still remains to be meshed with CIP and your other plans. Kind of talked about the scope, but yes.
Does that constitute good faith then?
It does. Toward the end of this, and I might as well just say it now, we certainly urge the city to every year budget for and make expenditures for retrofits. That shows that it's not just a plan sitting digitally somewhere gathering whatever kind of micro dust it would gather. And there have been, the Department of Justice knows its way to Iowa. There have been other jurisdictions that have had a knock on the door from area code 202. And I think by far the best way to avoid that is to do what you've done and to be proactive and get a transition plan in place. So our scope included the 51 parks and facilities. I mentioned the community engagement. Thank you, Mainstream. We put together the phased retrofit schedule or transition plan. That's really all it is. It's a schedule of what we recommended by priority. And then we reported to city and department leadership on our findings. I think I'll just jump to the bottom of this slide. Why audit facilities? It's the right thing to do. Certainly the city council and the Parks and Recreation Commission, you don't want people without disabilities to have access to something that people with disabilities can't enjoy. So it's just the right thing to do. And that's really the overarching reason why it's in here. Our process is very detail oriented. We have staff, as Keith mentioned, a lot of us worked in Parks and Recreation, so we know what a park looks like. We're not surprised when we see certain types of assets. And we evaluate everything. In a restroom alone, we evaluate about 21 different components. We use pretty simple tools. My cell phone is somewhere in my pocket. I'm not going to drag it out. But we use an app that we've put our customized checklists onto. So we select the federal 2010 standards, then we select Iowa requirements, and then we also use our own smart practices. Other than that, it's a 2-foot digital level and a tape measure and a door pressure gauge. So this isn't complex from a tool perspective. We do believe in checklists. Rocket scientists use checklists. Brain surgeons use checklists. I think checklists are a very valuable tool. So we base a lot of our field work on checklists as well. We'll stick around. We know that there will be questions as you go through the reports, and we'll answer the phone and, more importantly, give you the answer to the questions when those arise. Common issues, some of the things that we saw. This slide shows some good and some things that should have been done a little bit differently. So the top is park amenities that lack accessible features. So you have picnic tables there, but none of those picnic tables are of an accessible design. But in the bottom left, you've got a compliant and accessible picnic table and a route right to it. Top right, you've got grills that lack the wheelchair space. If I'm the picnic cooker, I can't get to that and use it. But then at the bottom right, you've got a grill that is accessible. So it's clear that staff and contractors understand the concepts here. I think this is perhaps a matter of just a little catch up.
Yeah, maybe just make one comment quick. If you go back to that last slide and that lower right picture, you can obviously see the Miracle Park in the background. So one of the things that John made a comment, and I think it's worth saying, John, just when you heard him talk about the scope of work across the country, when he saw this park, he actually indicated that it's one of his top 5 playgrounds that he's ever seen. And he has mentioned that to some of his colleagues who in turn have called me and even have come and visited the park because they're looking at doing something in their own community. So there is this isn't all gloom and doom with things. There are a lot of good things that we are doing.
Can you charge for that, Keith? Because we need some more revenue to pay for these programs.
Yeah.
I'll pay you $5 later. One of my friends is a Parks and Rec director in the Chicago suburbs, and like a lot of communities, they've gotten a request from families of kids with mobility impairments saying, "Hey, we want more access to playgrounds." And his daughter just started in Ames as a freshman this fall, so he was one of the first people I connected with Keith, and he stopped by. He and his wife have stopped by, so we refer people to you a lot because of sites like this. Parking, this picture could be taken anywhere from Groton, Connecticut to Palm Beach to right here in Ames. Parking is really, really hard to get right. The slope requirement is very difficult, 2.08% in any direction for both the parking stall and the access aisle. I think I can mention McDonald's. The next time any of you are at McDonald's, or if you want to just drive through the parking lot, look at their accessible parking. They use concrete for the accessible parking stalls. The rest of the lot is asphalt. Concrete's easier to get to cure at the right slope. So it's a great idea to borrow that from our friends in the private sector. Accessible routes, this became a big issue when the 2010 standards became effective in 2012. Grass and dirt are never an accessible route. So where you do have poured surfaces like this, it's really important that maintenance be such that gaps are never greater than a half inch, changes in level are never greater than a fourth of an inch. Playgrounds, it's pretty common to see engineered wood fiber, which requires a significant amount of maintenance to not be level or to be kicked out, like in the picture on the right. That's just pure kick out. That's engineered wood fiber that's gone home in kids' shoes, shorts, shirts, and socks. Restrooms, just a couple of things here. Grab bars are located outside of the compliant range. There's a really specific dimension for grab bars because they're built on the 95th percentile human arm length, torso, leg length, and so forth. So there's a real science behind it. The picture on the right shows a hand dryer that protrudes more than 4 inches. That's a protruding object. So if I'm a person who's blind and I'm walking along the wall, I'm going to walk right into that. So some of these are pretty simple concepts that can be addressed at installation or certainly with your contractor. Community gardens, there's not a section in the standards about community gardens. And we inserted this picture in the left. This is a nice example of kind of an alternative at the bottom left to making a garden bed accessible. The community garden up in the top left needs an accessible route to it. I think you can see that there's grass and maybe loose gravel there. Picnic table on the right is a good example of the way we would do it in 2010. Let's get a picnic table and we're going to put it in the park on grass. And you can do that for some, but roughly 1 out of every 5 should be on an accessible route.
Keith, was the Delaware Community Garden not finished yet when WT Group did their assessment? I noticed there were only 2 community gardens assessed.
Yeah, it was under construction when they were here. So we didn't finish until afterwards.
I'd be curious how that one rates compared to the other 2.
Passes with flying colors.
The transition plan, the Department of Justice says must include 4 things. You need a 5th thing that helps, and that's money. But the transition plan has to identify every barrier, has to recommend a solution or a treatment for some. So for some, it might be leave as is until it's next replaced or altered. You have to name a person responsible for barrier removal and note a date by which barrier removal occurs. In our reports, that's a phase. I think in your implementation schedule, you'll have an opportunity to tighten it down a bit to a fiscal year. We know that every city, though, needs cost references for planning purposes. You can't adopt a plan like this without having a sense of the fiscal impact. We already talked about the number of years that you can go. Absent guidance, more clear guidance on this subject, we often peg a Parks and Recreation transition plan at anywhere from 9 to 12 to 16 years. It depends on the agency and how big you are. We talked earlier about integrating the transition plan with other city plans. I think that's really important. It allows for a greater efficiency in the use of your resources. Phase 1, we stretched for 6 to 9 years, touches almost 3 million. It includes unique sites, work at recent sites that is not compliant, and low-hanging fruit. That's work that you can accomplish with existing human and fiscal resources. I think it's worth mentioning the work at recent sites that's not compliant. This happens everywhere. As I said in the beginning, the design might be right, but the contractor maybe is having a bad Monday or Tuesday and just gets it wrong. A pretty common example that we see is grab bars and accessible stalls that are centered at 36 inches instead of in the range of 33 to 36. That automatically means they're going to fail, and that's automatically a take. Phase 2 included work in areas new to the 2010 standards like sports fields and courts, playground surfaces and components, and certain other park assets like golf and pools. So we had that at about 1.1 million. Phase 3 included work in 2 areas, those that are not yet addressed by a final standard, such as trails, and then elements where correction is complex or costly. So that came in at a little bit under 800,000. We did have, as I mentioned, some smart practices. Yes, sorry.
Just a quick question then. Are the programs then considered in that low-hanging fruit when we think about making sure that programs, not facilities, are accessible?
They can be. So as an example, today when we did the trainings at the golf course, I'm assuming that golf course room could be used for other purposes too. So if there's a meeting or an activity that's scheduled for another facility and for whatever reason it's not compliant, could it move to the golf course and be compliant for that one session? So that ability for you to relocate programs or even duplicate it, run the same program at the golf course when it's not golf season, that you're running at another facility that perhaps is not fully compliant.
Okay.
So that's a good way to think of the program access test. If you can move it from site to site and make that program compliant, that works.
Right. What about, I know you talked about interpretation and those kinds of things. Is that considered pretty low-hanging fruit because we can identify people perhaps in the community to be able to do that work?
It really isn't. We really limited our scope here to
Okay.
the programs within buildings, not so much
Okay.
the supports that somebody might need for inclusive participation.
Okay.
So if I'm deaf or hard of hearing and I need a sign language interpreter to make public comment tonight,
Right.
that would be a different way to look at this.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. You already do this, I'm sure, but I would just encourage you to act like risk managers. Be proactive and not reactive. There are a lot of changes in how people with disabilities move. Wheelchair size is a good example. They're bigger, longer, heavier. There are new methods for treatment of people. There are new treatments for people with different health conditions. So I think it's important to be aware of that. I already talked about the design, construction, and maintenance issue and which one you have absolutely under your control. Demographics, I think, is important to mention. By 2030, there will be more Americans 65 and up than under 18 for the first time in our history. So why does that have anything to do with disability? The typical incidence of disability is around 12% for the entire population. For people over 65, it's a staggering 42%. So that's triple what we see right now in the general population. So being accessible and being compliant is important for today in 2023, but it's even more important come 2030 when you're going to have a significantly larger incidence of disability and number of people who have disabilities. Just a couple of things in conclusion. As staff digest reports and the recommendations that we made, we will be here to answer questions and navigate the documents and the findings. We've already talked about integrating this with other city and department plans. That's really important. I think I want to emphasize that staff continues implementation. It's clear that you have a staff that is aware of inclusion and accessibility concepts, and that should just continue. And then last but not least, the community of people in Ames who have a disability is not a monolith. So continue to conduct outreach to the various different populations. If I have a son who's on the autism spectrum, my interests are going to be completely different than if I myself am hearing impaired or have lost vision. So it's important to kind of hear from everybody on this, and certainly in annual budget processes, you have the opportunity to do so. It's been great to work with the staff. Keith and I both got the same memo about wearing the same color shirt today. So we've bonded over stuff like that, things small and large. But we've enjoyed working with Joshua and Courtney too. And can I answer any other questions? I think I've stretched my 30 minutes is about as far as I can go.
So is there a more detailed attachment that goes with this so that staff knows what to be done? Your report is pretty, overarching, which we understand. I was just curious, do they have direction where it says do this or do this in general?
It is, or we do. Each site, each of the 51 sites that we saw got its own site report that highlights the deficit, how we recommend it be treated, whether we recommend it be left as is under the program access test and so forth.
Thank you.
So what John's referring to is this is what we got for every one of the 51 sites. So, and you can see this is Ada Hayden, and you can see this is page 4 out of 122. So what it does is it kind of it gives you the area description. It gives us an exact location, what the finding is, what it was built, the as-built, and then the recommended action. And you can see on the top one, recommended action, none. Second one, the repair bevel, ramp, CIL is a change in the level, installs and access aisles. So, we could go through, and we didn't want to inundate you, but you can see, these are the site reports that we received. And then from there, we took that information, or not we, but what WT Group did is, wrong one. This one?
Yeah, it's in there.
This one. So then what they did is they took all that information and then they put it into this. So this is the draft transition plan summary. And if you look, I'm going to do this left-handed, not very good. Why don't you click down on that Ada Hayden. So
CAF.
So there, when you take a look now, it gives you kind of a breakdown of at Ada Hayden, not only the 5 different phases, but it also tells you, accessible routes, clear floor space, curb ramps, and so on. The different areas or different categories that we're looking at with each of those. So to your answer to your question, Mayor, there are thousands of pages of information that WT Group has given us that now staff has to kind of sort through. And those items that I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, that's what we'll sort through, develop, and bring those back to the commission and then eventually to council for adoption.
Those individual items budgeted, or do you just have one budget for a big group? I'm just trying to think through as you're thinking through, CIP and your budget going forward. Is there enough details okay, I've got X number of dollars to work with, and I really want to work on this, and this, or is it more or less just like a phase 1, 2, 3? And I am not being critical. I was just curious what tool do you have to work with? Because obviously we're going to have some challenges fiscally, and just trying to make sure we can make it.
Right. So if you take a look at just phase 1, and let's just for simplicity's sake, the range was 6 to 9 years. Let's just say 9 years, to accomplish phase 1. Just over $2.8 million. So over $300,000 a year. Now with that, we'll have to again take a look, and some of that dollar amount may already be included in another CIP project. It may be included in another replacement plan, which is part of the CIP. The other thing that we do and if you remember, we used to, well, we still do in the CIP, we have an ADA transition plan account. And, up till this year, we were putting $25,000 in there just as a placeholder. This year, we upped it up to $100,000 a year. But even if all of these things in phase one needed to be done, again, $300,000 a year, we have $100,000. You can do the math. There's going to be some shortfalls. Now, some of that we'll be able to do with our staff. Maybe it won't cost a lot more than just labor to do some of these things. So that's really what we have to look at. And when we come back to you, to commission and to council, we'll hopefully have some of that information to share with you so you can see, hey, is there a shortfall? Isn't it? One of the other things that we'll be doing is taking every one of these items and putting a year. When do we think? And again, that's going to be based on the priority. Is it a high priority? Is it a low priority? One of the things that we got from the WT group that really resonated with me, I think with all of us, is some of the priorities that they talked about is first off for people is, can they park? When they go to a park, can they park? Is there accessible parking? And then when they get out of their vehicle, are there accessible routes to the places that they want to go? And probably the third priority is the restroom. Can they go to use a restroom when they're at these places? So some of those things that, again, John and his staff have been very good answering questions, giving us direction. Those are all things that we'll look at and try to sort out prior to bringing this back to the commission and council.
You make a good point. Many of these are what I call maintenance items.
Mm-hmm.
So they wouldn't normally be something you issue bonds for to correct. You wouldn't issue bonds for 15 years to correct patching sidewalks or moving things. So that's going to be a challenge for us as the state is limiting us to 3.25% increase in our general levy. This would normally come out of general levy type of expenditure. So that's something we're going to have to take a hard look at. We obviously have local option tax, but everybody's trying to fight for that money with bicycle paths, and the state's even talking about maybe sharing that revenue with other cities. So that'll lower our amount. So it's going to be a challenge. I'm sure we'll be able to do a lot of this. Whether we'll be able to keep pace with that, I don't know yet. That's what we need the staff to go back, and they'll have to establish criteria as far as implementation, even within the phase one. Obviously, safety items are going to be the top priority, right? And then you're going to have to deal with other criteria. Could be a low-hanging fruit we'll deal with right away. That won't be a problem, but it'll take criteria to try to prioritize these. And we probably won't know until next year about where we stand financially, how we're going able to accomplish all this. But it's a big lift for us with restraints by the state government on us.
Since phase one, though, 6 to 9 years, right?
Correct.
So I was just trying to understand how do you have enough information for the Ames the ISU ice arena? It shows $180,000. Do you have an idea if you're going to do if there's 15 sheets? Do you? I'm just trying to make sure that you have the tools that you need for budgeting and not just guessing.
Yes.
To parse it out. If you are, that's fine. Then that answers my question.
Yeah, we do. And with some of the items, the WT group did include, I think, 5% per year.
That was another question. Do you have any kind of inflation
for
factor,
inflation. So I think, just with Courtney, Joshua, and I, conversations that we've had, we think that there were a couple things that made it easier for us, but we worked with John and his staff, and they've done things to make it easier for us to make the connection between some of the documents. But right now we feel we pretty much have all the information. The biggest struggle for us is finding the time, to go through it all and sort it out and then bring something back to the two groups here.
John, could you clarify, maybe you've already said this and I'm just not catching it. So the federal and state minimums, right?
Standards, yes.
Standards.
Design standards.
Right. And so if you were to give the city of Ames a letter grade on just the standards we have now, what would that be? Is there a way of doing that?
Well, as far as what we saw at parks and facilities, is that what you mean?
Right. Based on the standards.
I'd say you're a solid B plus. It's clear that staff get this. It's clear that there's support from council for this kind of activity. So I'd say you're a solid B plus. There certainly are some things, and some of these are small. We saw, I think, 3 or 4 different types of accessible parking signs. So standardization of signs would be a really easy efficiency to undertake.
So I want to tease out the difference. So what I'm hearing is that there's an aspirational level that we want to strive towards, and that's awesome. What I'm looking at right now is just the ADA compliance that we have now. And so if we look at that, that's a B plus.
No, I misunderstood your question.
Yeah.
If you were to get to the recommended one of every 3 that we're talking about with what you currently have in place, I think you're at B plus. Is that what you were asking?
No, I apologize. So I'm trying to understand where we are now. If you line us up next to the federal and state standards, not the aspirational, but just the standards right now, what would you give us for a grade? We had A, we had D.
I think we're close to saying the same thing,
Okay.
Counselor. We made a point in the transition plan of separating phase 1, 2, and 3 out from smart practices. So the phase 1, 2, and 3 work was in the $4 to $4.5 million range, and then the smart practice work was another give or take $4 million. So we've already separated out what we think is a recommendation from us that's required under the 2010 standards and Iowa requirements.
So maybe I'll just add to it, and it's something in the staff report and in the report from WT Group. So throughout the 51 sites, there were over 2,000 deficits that were found.
Deficits as to
As things that weren't
standards
in compliance,
that are what?
that were not in compliance.
And so how many did you say?
Just over 2,000.
So-
So when you look at that over 51 sites, it's about 40 deficits per site. And maybe that is a way to.
That's a great number. We just finished a similar report for a jurisdiction that is smaller than you that had about 3,500 deficits. So your sites are in very good shape.
And so I'm going to be really precise with you. So deficits as to the standards, not the aspirational, but
Correct.
the standard.
Deficit means it does not meet the current minimum requirements of the federal 2010 standards or any Iowa standards that are more stringent.
And so you did a nice job of helping us think through design, construction, and maintenance. Could you delineate of the 2,000 approximately how many are construction, how many are design, how many are maintenance? Is that possible?
It probably is. We try not to look at that when we're at a site. I can tell you the example I used about grab bars in a restroom. We know the designer said put them between 33 and 36. And we know the contractor probably just centered it at 36, which is contrary to the design requirement. So that's an easy one. We'd probably say that's a contractor issue. I said at the beginning that 31 years into the ADA that most architects, engineers, and landscape architects do design per the minimum standards. But we certainly still see some exceptions, but most do. I'm tempted to cut them into thirds, and say a third is maintenance, a third is contractor, and a third is design, but I'd probably make it more like 40%, 40%, 20% design related.
So, I mean, that's helpful because we're building things here in Ames.
Right.
And so if we know that there's substantial portions on design and construction, then those are things that we can be mindful of in that process. We have control more directly of the maintenance side, but that's a helpful data point for us to understand how we group those 2,000 deficits. Thank you.
And you have to also remember that some of this stuff was built and constructed prior to the
Totally.
standards. So like
Totally.
Ice Arena,
Yeah.
a lot of these things are going to have to be brought into compliance because of they didn't have those standards at the time.
Right.
Most of our shelters.
Right.
Yeah.
Our shelters were built, well before that. And some of the items too, if you look at up at the screen, just clear floor space. I know there's no dollars associated with it, but one of the things that, out at Homewood, we were talking, John pointed out, that one of the deficits is that right next to a door, there's a trash can. And in that trash can, it makes sense, that people are leaving the door, throw their trash away, but it doesn't give you the recommended clearance space, that you need around there. So that garbage can just needs to be moved into another location. So there are a number of things like that. One of the things at the ice arena, when they were out there, we were shut down. We had boxes laying all over the place. We had different things, they identified that there were boxes in hallways that prevented somebody from moving through there. So there's a lot of different things with those deficits. I think some are, that we can address, kind of that low hanging fruit that Steve had talked about. But then there's some that have already been taken care of, that are already done.
So would it make sense to just program in, and I don't know what the frequency is, every 5 years or 10 years, to have another one of these audits done just to see if we made any improvement? Is that something that if we're committed to this, does that seem like something we should just build in?
I wouldn't suggest every 5 years. And I think I'd suggest that there are a couple of different ways to approach it. For Parks and Recreation accreditation, there's a national accreditation program for excellence in Parks and Recreation administration. It requires a fresh transition plan every 10 years. But there are other approaches. We've had clients come back to us and say, hey, here's our 1,100 item list of things we've retrofit since 2010. Can you evaluate just those while we're still working on the remaining 900? So there are many other approaches that you can take aside from a full audit.
Well,
Wouldn't
and
the- sorry.
go
Steve,
ahead. Sorry. The other thing is it's ongoing, right? Like you're going to have potholes every spring and you're going to, that trash can, someone's going to move it back or whatever. So it's like, some of these smaller things, I think in your presentation, you mentioned maintenance, and I mean, I manage a chemical lab, and maintenance is a big part of it. Like, yeah, like sometimes you do need a new piece of safety equipment, but a lot of it is just making sure what you have is working. And I think, on commission, we spend a lot of time talking about like when we do get a new facility, making sure that we also are budgeting the money to maintain that adequately, because some of these new features are awesome, but they are, they're expensive to maintain and keep them, at a usable and safe standard for the residents. So, I think that's a big piece of it.
It is, and there clearly is an interface between safety and access. Of 1/2 inch change in level will stop me if I'm in a mobility device, but it's also a trip hazard if you want to look at it that way as well. So there's kind of a universal design aspect to why it makes sense to treat that low-hanging fruit as Steve was describing it.
Yeah. And in some respects, it is a little bit whack-a-mole because you're going to fill that pothole, but or that crack or whatever. But,
It's gonna
you
come
just
back.
have to be, vigilant with with that type of standard. It's hard.
I assume that's why on ball fields it says Inus Grove maintain accessibility, because I thought, why is the Miracle Park showing up on there? It just got built. But if we're looking at maintaining the surface or ensuring that we don't have those changes in level, which maybe that's not what that meant, but
It likely is. I mean, literally access is a matter of an inch here and an inch there. The mirror might be 41 inches high and it's supposed to be no higher than 40 inches in a restroom. Change in level, a half an inch is pretty small, but that'll stop a lot of people in a mobility device. It'll be a trip hazard for people using a walker or a cane. So there's a good connection between doing this for safety reasons and doing it for accessibility reasons, especially with that demographic piece that I mentioned earlier.
Well, to Tim's point about the need to do another audit at some point, if we take the recommendation to acquire and maintain the certified ADA coordinator credential, presumably that kind of credentialing is going to lead to more ongoing critical viewing of what we're doing and how we're managing our programs and our facilities. And I wonder about that credentialing too, whether that's something that would be specific to Parks and Rec, or if that's something that's citywide and is maybe connected to the DEI coordinator position or something.
That is a responsibility of the DEI position.
Yeah. Yeah. So right now,
Coordinator.
Mhm.
so right now, Deb is the city's ADA coordinator. But like Steve mentioned, looking to make that the DEI responsibility. Yet for our department, we're looking at Courtney, to be our department coordinator. And it is something that John spoke today about, is that how do we go about getting a certified ADA coordinator? Now, if we had we just said Jill Burt, who is now down in finance. She was our aquatics manager. She had a therapeutic recreation degree. If she was still on staff, she would have been a good one to help with some of the things that we would need to be doing. So there's a number of ways, but yeah, I think we look to Courtney to really hone in on our stuff, yet be a resource, for everybody else within the city, because some of these things, walkways and so on, all is the same. But then the DEI coordinator to really be that person for the overall umbrella for the city.
So with the, go ahead, sorry.
Go ahead. Oh, I was just thinking back to what was it called? Safe walks that we did in Campus Town. And like the park system is a much larger thing. But when I lived in Campus Town, we had a safe walks group and we would meet at the intermodal, and then we would, there were 20 of us or whatever, and we would all take a street. And that was like just pointing out these deficiencies that change from year to year, the potholes, the cracks, whatever. And I'm just thinking about like, how do you keep on top of it without it being just like a massive staff burden? And that was actually like a pretty well received like community event. I don't know. Anyway, that just popped in my mind.
I had thought about that too, Sarah.
Good times.
Well,
Need you have a question or comment?
Yeah.
I was just
You're
going
gonna
to say
fix
something
this.
to what Sarah just mentioned. And then that's where we can take a look to some of our friends groups,
Yeah.
at the Friends of Ada Hayden. They'd be able to help us. That's why we did the training. John did the training with our maintenance staff this morning and our program managers this afternoon. So when they're out there doing these things, they have at least an understanding of it, and they can help us. Like, oh, hey, we probably need to take a look at this because we were out in Innis Grove today and we noticed that. Or, hey, when we were in, running a program at Furman Aquatic Center, there are some things that we noticed that we probably need to look at. So I think we got to look at it from a number of different prongs to help us stay on top of everything. And it's, the three of us also, when we're out looking at things, takes a keen eye to just see some of these things and say, it's really easy to go into a park and say, oh, this looks great. But really be critical or look at it with a critical eye and say, oh, these are some things that we need to address.
Nita?
Well, and mine actually is just tied to the training piece and just asking if that's part of the plan, is making sure that we know how frequently, for instance, that maintenance staff may want to be reminded of those expectations. And if there's a turnover in staff, then what's that onboarding look like so that everyone knows how to go forward with that work?
Counselor, that's a great point. And we did talk about the National Recreation and Park Association and the American Camping Association and a number of other groups that have developed canned online trainings. Some of it is 15 minutes long, some of it's an hour, a range of different topics. I know we try just for our own staff to have quarterly 3-hour trainings on a topic that is evolving or gives us difficulty in interpretation. So I think training is a key part of it, but of course, training takes time.
I just keep thinking about EH&S because so they usually come and do the safety survey in my lab every year, and they're like, oh, usually it's minor stuff. There's a box or there's a trash can or, whatever. This is missing a waste tag, and that's really critically important because OSHA and the EPA can fine the university zillions of dollars, and it's very expensive. So it's important to stay on top of that. But this year, they actually let me do my own safety survey, which I don't know, it was kind of empowering. It was, and I think like, when you are trained to look for those deficiencies, like I think you can have, through the friends group, a training to like say, like, these are the things to look out for. You have a checklist, whatever. And that would be like a really efficient citizen-led way, because I think also people who use the parks, I'm emailing you all the time stupid things about, Emma McCarthy Lee because I'm there 4 times a week or whatever. So, those people notice things and they care. So I think, across the city, we have a very caring and committed group of park users and citizens. So
Any commission members have any questions or comments?
other than me.
They'll just roll up to you.
Yeah, all they had just went.
That's fair. I usually end up talking a lot.
John, I'm curious. Do you also do plan review?
We do. We do a lot of staff training. We do a lot of plan review. In fact, when I go back to my room tonight, that's one of the things I'll be working on. So I think people have really bought into the notion of let's get it right the first time, or get it more right the first time.
I'm just thinking, Keith, with even though the architect who's been hired is contractually bound to design according to ADA, I'm just wondering, with a $31 million facility, if it makes sense for a belt and suspenders, hire someone just to do maybe you already thought about that, but hire someone to do that, but then also someone goes through and if stuff is not put in correctly, it's required to be changed before final payment is made, because there's no excuse that it shouldn't be built according to ADA and all the other standards. The first time, an example of the hand dryer for sake of discussion,
Right.
I mean, those type of things are really important, and the city should not have to pay for that to fix it if it was supposed to be done right to start with.
Yeah. So I don't know if John remembers this, but way when we got back started with this whole process, I did bring that up about the indoor aquatic center and potentially a plan review, for ADA. But the second part of it is the conversation that we've been having, and Steve and I have had this conversation, and Deb as well, about, it's designed, and then, like in the case of the aquatic center, having that conversation with Story Construction and saying, hey, that all of this stuff, this was designed for a reason. We have ADA plastered all over the contracts, that you need to make sure that this is built according to specs. So we have had some of those conversations. We just have to have more conversations with a little bit with RDG, more so with Story Construction, And then we'll see if John can help us out with the plan review when we get to that point.
I don't want to disparage either RDG or Story because I'm sure they do extremely excellent work. And the point is that it's just sometimes things get missed and or caught. And I think is you brought up a good point. Visually impaired sometimes is overlooked. Audibly impaired. I mean, don't make any bones about it. I have difficulty hearing. So the point is, how can you provide hearing devices or hearing amplification for people? So it's broad. It's not just basically wheelchair or walker. It's also access into a pool basin. Someone who you want people who have visual impairment to be able to enjoy the same facility, or like you said, autistic or whatever. Let's make sure that we think of all of that to make it a very inclusive, just like the miracle field or playground is. That's a tremendous asset. We want the aquatic center to be exactly the same thing.
It's a key part. And I think too, even for people with certain types of intellectual impairments, the independence of being able to wheel up to a counter or walk up to a counter that's at the right height and transact business on their own. That's a really empowering thing to do. Somebody mentioned empowerment before. I mean, that's a great side benefit to accessibility that a lot of times people don't think about.
That made me think of the windows down at the community center entry, which are pretty high. Wonder if we're going to be changing those if they're on our audit. I was thinking about what Sarah said regarding OSHA and EPA and fines and losing money, and getting out ahead of this stuff just seems, first of all, it's sensible, right? Because it's the right thing. But it's also getting out ahead of lawsuits that other communities have been hit with for not addressing ADA non-compliant features.
That's true. I think out of the other Iowa jurisdictions that I'm aware of, really one originated because of a dispute between the school district and parents of kids with disabilities. The others were a knock on the door from the Department of Justice and kind of a quasi-random visit. I do think it's worth mentioning that a thing those three have in common that you do not have in common with them is that they did not have a transition plan. So what you've done is really a step in the right direction from the risk management perspective as well.
Any other questions or comments?
Is it possible for us to get this live spreadsheet instead of just the PDF version so we could see what the?
Oh, I thought we gave you the Excel document, but maybe not.
I didn't
doesn't-
see
It's
it.
just people.
The one we have, you can't do the little.
Yeah, it doesn't drop down.
We can get that to
Because
you.
we want to change the numbers. We want to lower them.
I love numbers.
We'll hang on to the master. But no, we can get that to you.
I'm just curious about some of the recommendations and where they fall.
How about we split up all the plans to the council? And you guys
And
can be at
commissioners,
15.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, we
How about
have to
not?
review about it's a review about maybe 4 apiece here. That would be good.
I think I have one other question actually related to this sheet, and maybe this is more of a Steve question. I noticed that the park that has the largest number for investment is Brookside. And we don't own Brookside, right? We have a contract. So I'm not saying we should not invest in Brookside because clearly we're programming Brookside and that's our responsibility. But where does that put us with the university? Is the lease that we have ironclad and therefore?
Well, we have to look at each of the recommendations, any facility we have out there, including benches or, excuse me, or any of our shelters, that's all of our responsibility. It would take some kind of excavation on the park. We'd have to get their approval for, but I don't think there's going to be a problem there. I haven't looked at in depth of all the recommendations, but I believe they're our responsibility to fix.
Mhm.
if they're tied to our facilities.
Yeah. Now, one of the things too, as we go through these items, and I have not looked directly at Brookside to see what all the recommendations are and so on. But one of the things as we're going through these, discussion that the three of us have had is taking a look and saying, are some of those amenities, that maybe we have to put a lot of money into it? Is it still worth, doing that? For example, we have 4 playgrounds, I think, right? 4 playgrounds at Brookside.
Yes.
And maybe it's one of the things, if one is going to take a lot of money, maybe we say, let's do 3 playgrounds instead of 4. And that might be a savings, but yet we still are able to offer a variety of playgrounds at that site. One of the things, with the ball fields, there are some things there that maybe the cost of making the correction, it would be better off to remove it. I'm thinking bleachers, might be one of those things. We don't have the need for the bleacher setup that's there right now. Maybe we wind up taking down the bleachers and we do something different, and that reduces our cost. So I think those are all the things that we get to continue to look at, like we've mentioned a couple of times as we're going through. And then we may not have all those decisions made, right at this time, but those are things that we can at least say, hey, this is one that maybe we wind up remove versus renovate or replace, so it meets ADA requirements. Those are things that we can look at as well.
But and maybe you're not saying this, but just as a voice of caution, I'm worried about the law of unintended consequences here. We want to move towards making our facilities more accessible, but we want to do it in a way that makes sense. I mean, what if we had a situation where we took out facilities just for the sake of taking them out? That's a situation where the tail's wagging the dog, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, and that's not what I'm suggesting at all.
Okay.
That's not, we're not just going to take them out just for the sake of taking them out. It would have to make sense. And that's one of the conversations that we've had over time. I think with playgrounds at Brookside, probably 5 years ago, we started having, conversation with it, and we haven't come to an answer yet. So no, we're not going to just take things out for the sake of taking them out. That's not what we're saying.
And just a quick follow-up. If you look at Brookside, I would encourage you to draw a hard line between phase 3 and phase 4. We recommend that phase 1, 2, and 3 be the work you address first. Phase 4 and 5 can come later. And if you look at that, that immediately drops 470,000 off of the Brookside total. So there's a lot of balancing that you'll have to do here. And if it's a site that you don't own on your own, but you provide programs there, maybe there are other alternatives to consider, but it's not for me.
Well, and I think, as Keith mentioned, we've been having conversations about Brookside facilities. The bathroom renovation was a big one, and that was necessary because of fire damage, but that's done now, and I hope it's done to spec. And but thinking about playgrounds, well, maybe we go from 4 to 3, but are we making one of the picnic shelters more accessible, and then making the playground equipment that's near that picnic shelter also that is, the more accessible playground equipment in the park? And then you have, you're kind of programming in, kind of an accessibility cluster of programming, in one part of the park. So, I think there are some mindful things that can be done to address, multiple things. And, like North River Valley Park, that's another one where we're thinking a lot about the shelter, and there's a road between the shelter and the new canoe launch now. And so how can we make that safer, and moving the playground? And, so a lot of these things can be approached holistically. Yeah.
Yep. All right. Thank you very much. Is there anything else? There's no action tonight, Keith, so you're just presenting it and for information, and you're going to come back in the future with some recommendation, or are you looking for any specific direction tonight from council or from Parks and Recreation Commission?
No, I think just having this dialogue and hearing some of the questions that council has will help us as we go through this next phase. So at this point, I don't think there's really any direction that we're looking for. I think we got a lot of good feedback tonight, and we'll be back in the future.
Do you have a target for that, when we're going to be back? I can tell Joshua's chomping at
Well, when we have talked about this, what we would like to do is have something adopted before July 1st. Because
Be careful, Keith.
well, I didn't say we will, but the thing is with the money and with the plan, that we're looking at right now, starts with that fiscal year. Will we get there? Don't know. But we have to start somewhere. We don't want to come back a year from now with it. We want to do it while it's fresh, and are there some things that we can start getting after? So
Well, I don't think we want to wait on anything. It's a safety issue. We're going to move on right away.
right. But at least we have to go through all the information to identify, those safety issues. So that's I don't know if that's the answer you're looking for, but we'll try to get to it as quickly as we can. So we can start addressing safety issues and
I think
And-
to be
and moving
safe, it's
forward.
not going to be a year, and I would like to have some flexibility if it's goes into the summer a little bit, just in case.
yeah.
Real quickly, I really appreciate the effort. This is obviously a lot of work went into this. Just real quickly, when I was probably 19, one of my close friends was in a swimming accident and she became paralyzed from the waist down. I had never known anyone who needed a wheelchair before. And that turned my world upside down, because then I started looking at buildings from a different set of eyes. I started looking at facilities from a different set of eyes. I walk on campus and I think about how my friend would access buildings. And I think it speaks well for the community that we would think highly enough about the importance of saying we want everyone to be at the table. And so this has been a good exercise tonight. Thanks for that.
Well, and universal design makes things accessible for everyone, right? So it's not like you're making it accessible for one set of people like some of the things we have now are.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Commission members, thank you for your service. It's the first time we've had a joint meeting for a long time, I think. So, and we say this to all boards and commissions, but you guys do the heavy lifting. We appreciate that. And so we are so proud of our Parks and Recreation. And I know it's all because of the boards and commissions and nothing because of staff. Staff always tells me that.
Where we are without.
So anyway, we just have two quick items that we need to take care of before we have council comments. So
Do you want commission to adjourn?
you're welcome to stay
Okay.
if you want. It doesn't take very long.
Okay.
Actually, stay longer so you can go ahead and enjoy our time. No, you're if you want to, you can adjourn if you wish.
There wasn't a trick question.
Oh.
Come on, Brown.
Okay. I have commission is adjourned. So first commission. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. All right, our disposition and communications to council. We have two items. One's an email from Robert Sommerfeld regarding restrictions on backyard camping during Ragbri.
I mentioned that at our Discover Ames meeting. So I know that at least if there's coordination going on where people volunteer their backyards, Discover Ames will be messaging about the need to have facilities. This seems to be friends. So
Yeah, I saw the Summerfelds in the store, and I just mentioned that, I appreciated their feedback, but I thought it was probably a big ask in terms of being able to actually enforce anything like that. And that, while I understood where they were coming from, that it was probably not something
And
that
and
we'd
honestly,
be able to do.
I'll go on a limb and speak for all Ragbri riders. I don't think any of them use the restroom out in the grass. I think they use kaibos and restrooms. So I'm not particularly concerned. And we drink from water fountains or hoses all the time. It's Ragbri.
All right, so I'll take it as no action. All right, second is electric vehicle charging stations within setbacks. Memo from Kelly.
So
moved.
Yeah, we're taking a proactive view on this. We know that
Yeah.
EV chargers are very important to you. Kelly's trying to step forward and know if we want to accomplish this, we're going to have to make some changes in the zoning ordinance. We want to have that discussion on a future agenda for you, get some direction. We can move ahead with that.
Yep. We'll put on the agenda. It's good.
Second.
Those in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
The only thing I'd have, just from a safety perspective, be interesting to see, are there some safety concerns by putting those, is there a place where we too close to the street, right? So there must be some kind of minimum setback for those kind of facilities.
We can look at that.
Yeah.
Okay. Bronwyn, any comments tonight?
No comments for me. Thanks.
Rich,
Nothing tonight.
Amber,
Nothing for me.
Nina,
Thanks.
Tim?
I think, thanks.
No, thanks.
All right. With that, entertain a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you.